Hello, welcome to the Mayhair Baba program. My name is Billy Goodrum, and today's special guest is Adele Wolkin. Welcome, Adele. Thank you for coming. Today's program, Adele will tell us about her life with Mayhair Baba. Now, Adele, you met Mayhair Baba in 1952. Could you tell us a bit about what led up to your meeting with Mayhair Baba, the events in your life that led to that?
Right. Well, I always remember that I had a very great yearning to actually, I had an experience once when I was in a church writing a paper for my university class. I was looking at some pictures particularly of Jesus, and feeling, yes, somehow I'm going to travel that road where I meet the Christ when he comes again. I just sort of had that deep inner conviction that I would meet him again. Now, I was also a child of the time when World War II broke out, and I had a deep personal involvement in the war situation by way of having three brothers who were participants in one way or another through their medical background. And just the very fact of wartime was something very not reconcilable with my studies at the time, which were based on loving God. And God for me was mostly the protector and creator. Later on, when I learned about Eastern thought, one had to realize that there is a trinity to the whole concept of God. That is, he is the creator, the protector, and the destroyer in terms of course, ultimate creation again, because what is destroyed is just something which is in the transitional process of recreating eventually. Mm-hmm. And so I was seeking answers in my 20s. I was in my 20s.
Mm-hmm. And where were you at that point? And where were you located and what were you doing?
Yeah, well, I was in New York, which was my home. Mm-hmm. We had lived during the Depression of the mid-30s in Iowa. We'd moved there and lived there for 5 years. And so when I did return to New York, it was at the time when one of my brothers was sent abroad as a physician to Germany as a captain, and all the issues of war were very antagonistic to my own ideals and my own beliefs. I had been a member of the Fellowship of Reconciliation, for example, mm-hmm. and I had been sponsored by people at the college. I attended Columbia University.
Mm-hmm. In New York City.
In New York City. And because I had all these questions regarding the need to reconcile God, the all-loving Father, with a most unbelievable kind of war that I just majored in philosophy or comparative religion as well. And I was really just trying to find some answers because I wasn't brought up in any one religion. I was brought up in I would say for the most part, a rather agnostic family. Mm-hmm. But I had very strong spiritual leanings.
Mm-hmm. Now, at Columbia at that time, it would strike me that would be more of a very intellectually based pursuit of philosophy or religion. Were there things you were doing outside of your studies at school mm-hmm. In that kind of pursuit of the spiritual ideal?
I think you're right. My need always was to find myself. I think that's everyone's need. And I was in school, had friends who felt that, one friend in particular, that if there was a real intuition on his part that I should meet a certain very close friend of his who was pursuing the same path that I was, that is that of a seeker through many paths. One does find ultimately the one God, but then you might say there are many high roads to God, but you always are looking for the quickest high road. Mm-hmm. And I met this wonderful lady named Phyllis Frederick in one of the classes, and we had this mutual friend who introduced us. And she was the first person that, in my studies, I had been emphasizing, due to the curriculum of the university. I was exposed to Western philosophical and religious thought mostly. I did take advantage of the reciprocation of credits which was offered the student with Union Theological Seminary just mm-hmm. across the street. Mm-hmm. So that was an opportunity to take some very gratifying classes in Christian ethics, which was my major. Essentially, ethics was my major. And I found that atmosphere at least a little more tolerable and closer to what I was pursuing. Of course, if I had been born in the East, anyone with my direction would have been somehow driven to find a guru mm-hmm. or some wise man. Now, philosophy means love of wisdom, doesn't it? Yeah. And I just tell you one funny story about that. I remember later on, after I was out of Columbia University, reading about a student who enrolled in the philosophy department, and he actually found that he wasn't gaining a greater love or wisdom, or love of wisdom, and he actually he charged that in a lawsuit against the university, that he was not achieving what they had set down as one of their goals.
So he decided to sue Columbia University.
So he sued Columbia because he didn't...
breach of contract, so to speak.
Yes, that's very well said.
Well, now, you met Phyllis Frederick, who, by the way, went on to be instrumental in founding the Avatar Meher Baba Center of Southern California here in Los Angeles.
Exactly.
And you and Phyllis met, and you shared the very common interest of wanting some genuine spiritual experience. You just didn't want to think about it or talk about it. And so you began to explore what was available at that time in New York City, and this is the early 40s.
Yes, and she posed that very important question to me, which was, in your search, you have found that you do, I had told her, and she knew what studies I was pursuing. She said, I know that you learned that you love some of the saints very much, those particular saints who had developed systems of thought which could be included in a university program, such as St. Augustine and St. Catherine of Siena and St. Teresa Avila. And so she said, but you never told me whether you had ever read the Eastern philosophers or spiritual poets. I said, no. And there was nothing at Columbia that offered me that either. So, well, what she said was then that she had some beautiful experiences at what was called the Ramakrishna Vivekananda Center in New York. And that's true, what you say, that we explored that. And we explored various things, as a matter of fact, the Baha'i movement and the Theosophical movement. And this was all, of course, still in the realm of just exploration on my part. But it was leading to an awareness, and after I had read and just adored Ramakrishna and Vivekananda, I realized that the real search was this inner search. The intellect was getting to be less dominant, and much less dominant. I had realized that it's very layers and layers of consciousness, and there is such a thing as a ladder of consciousness, and intellect, as Baba eventually, when I read his discourses, just placed the intellect on the very first step of that ladder.
Yes. So the intellect fades and the intuition begins to increase, and that was leading you to a profound time in your life when you met three very interesting women who were disciples of Meher Baba, Countess Nadine Tolstoy, Princess Norina Matchabelli, and Elizabeth Patterson, who had recently arrived in New York from India after spending several years under close discipleship with Meher Baba. Now, you and Phyllis came into contact with these women, and I would love to hear about that.
That was, since everything happens by the will of God, and it is, as I have read a great deal of Meher Baba by this time, I would say that everything actually is planned, and there's a blueprint of our lives that is laid out, and so whatever is in a certain sense destined, which of course does not preclude free will, but from the standpoint that things are destined in addition to an area of free will, I would say that it was, in my life, just a perfect juncture at which to meet him, because I was pretty disillusioned with the intellectual pursuit of truth and wisdom and answers to a large extent, and because the heart side was left so empty. And when Phyllis called me up and she said, I'm just so thrilled with having heard one of these talks, but on the other hand, of course, I want to hear many before I come to any determination about it. But would you like to go and hear, I do have an invitation for you. It was to the private home at that time where these three disciples were residing and had been sent back by Meher Baba specifically to do his work in the West which at that time, as he had it in his divine blueprint, was to found a center. And he gave the specifications for it. I'd like to read something from the writings of one of his great English disciples on that subject. This is from the writings of Kitty Davy in this book called Love Alone Prevails. At this time, he had given 5 specifics for in 1941, when the women were still there under spiritual training. He had told these 3 who were part of a group of other disciples from different parts of the world that it was very important for him to have a center in the West, namely in America. And this, he called it, he wanted a home in the West. And this, of course, was the seed that he did sow in their hearts, and no sooner did they return than they started this tremendous endeavor, because his word was their law, and they were motivated in every way to do it. I might just read from the book that I mentioned. Baba, who lived simultaneously in the past, present, and future, had no doubt visualized and selected the spot long ago, but for reasons of his work, he always acted as though he did not know what lay ahead. So, Elizabeth's first reaction was naturally, what are we to look for? He intimated that this property might be any place in America, but that there were 5 specific qualifications which he had, so to speak, at the tip of his fingers. In brief, 1, the climate should be equable, it should have more than ample water, it should be on virgin soil, it should be land that could be tilled, and it should be given from the heart.
Given from the heart, what did he mean by that? That it should just be an expression of love? That it should just be given spontaneously to him for his home?
Well, you know, the full story of this, Billy, of course, is found in several places, and one of the best places is this book I mentioned, Love Alone Prevails. But what he meant by that condition involved, like everything else he ever did, it involves all the people with whom the individual he's working with is connected. For example, when he touched me, when I finally met him, I knew he touched my brothers, he touched my mother, my father, and my friends, my whole, all my connections.
Yes.
And so in this way, he touched Elizabeth's family.
I see. Now, he touched Elizabeth's family. They gave the land in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, 500 acres that met all the qualifications. It had fresh water. It had tillable soil. It had virgin forest. I've been there, and it's still virgin forest and incredibly beautiful.
Yes.
And during the time you were with these women, they were working on that, preparing for Baba's coming. And this is actually where you met Meher Baba, isn't it? For the
yes,
first time.
Exactly. That's right. And so we waited. We had to wait. After attending that first meeting, I went to many meetings because, as we put it, we sort of gave it the acid test. Since since we both had pretty disciplined minds, and we weren't, as I intimated before, we had taken sort of the pulse of the times in visiting various places. We never joined anything. We just were looking and feeling the truth of various things. Of course, as I said, we felt the truth of Vedanta.
But you were never initiated into
No, I felt the truth of mystical Christianity through the saints and through Jesus in the pure part of the Beatitudes, the Sermon on the Mount. But we had to return, and at one of the talks, the Norina Matchabelli, who gave the talks to the public, what she did was take notice of us. As she was given a very special work to do, since she was a very, in her own self, she was on a level which is one of those steps on the ladder of consciousness, which indeed was above intellect and far above even intuition. It was at the point of a greater enlightenment, and she followed what was described very beautifully in two books, which one can read, that have been written by her, fragments, and from a spiritual diary on the process called spiritual thought transmission. Now, in one of those talks, she felt guided to tell us that she would like us to have the opportunity to bring about what the founding of the center meant, namely Baba with his disciples to come here. Mm-hmm. It was his home in the West for him to do his work, because his whole work is to bring, as this beautiful photo tells you, happiness lies in making others happy, and that's Baba's total objective. And he is born to show us the way, how to love God, how to be God, become God ultimately ourselves after so many lifetimes. And the book that, if anyone's really interested in knowing what the ultimate goal is, which is God realization, they have to read God Speaks.
God Speaks by Meher Baba.
Right. And one of the things that I when I finally met Baba, asked to do was to read God Speaks many times. Mm-hmm.
And when you met Baba, that was 1952,
yes,
after the preparation with the women and working to
exactly
to take the virgin land at Myrtle Beach and establish facilities there, housing, and things like that. And you and Phyllis Frederick made the trip from New York to Myrtle Beach in order to meet Meher Baba, didn't you?
Yes, we did. But in the interim, from 44, which is when we were invited to live with the disciples, until 52, was a period when we were doing a lot of preparatory work in Myrtle Beach with them. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. And so you had been to Myrtle Beach several times.
Yeah, so I met him, and it was outstanding for its tremendous beauty, goodness, and complete feeling of having known him, that he knew me and I knew him, and that the purity of it. You know, as a young person, and I had heard of him when now I was just 31, the purity of it was a very, very big measure to me of the truth of what I considered the God-man and the Christ, because it was just such pure love. Only the purest feeling that I ever had for my mother and father was accentuated here in the purity of God. And I would love to read how Baba has been an influence in my life by trying to follow in my little way how to love God. To love God in the most practical way is to love our fellow beings. If we feel for others in the same way as we feel for our own dear ones, we love God. If instead of robbing others to help ourselves, we rob ourselves to help others, we are loving God. If we suffer in the sufferings of others and feel happy in the happiness of others, we are loving God. If instead of worrying over our own misfortunes, we think of ourselves as more fortunate than many, many others, we are loving God. If we endure our lot with patience and contentment, accepting it as His will, we are loving God. If we understand and feel that the greatest act of devotion and worship to God is not to hurt or harm any of his beings. We are loving God. To love God as he ought to be loved, we must live for God and die for God, knowing that the goal of life is to love God and find him as our own self. And that is the essence that Meher Baba has given us.
Thank you so much for reading that, Adele. That is very simple guidelines for living that I think we can all relate to. I hope you can come back and give us more details, because your experience with Baba and your life with Baba is so vast.
Yes.
Your work, since you met Meher Baba, your work here in the United States and working in India has been a very fascinating. I think it's a very fascinating story, and I hope you can return to tell us more about it on our next program. Thanks again for coming, Adele. Thank you so much. And
it's my great pleasure. And as I say, I just absolutely just touched the most top surface of what it is to meet the Master, the beloved, who is, we accept, those of us who do accept him, as Avatar.
Yes, Avatar Meher Baba. Thank you so much, Adele. Thank you for tuning in to the Meher Baba program, and stay tuned for our next program that will be airing soon. Thank you.